All right, now we get to start talking about some of the more intricate topics like population dynamics. So as we approach this, it's important that we understand what is a wildlife population. It's a snapshot at any given time or location, and it has to do with a species. So a wildlife population is the number of individuals that occur in a defined area. But the important piece here is that at any point in time, it could be a different number. So it's just simply a snapshot. And the reason for that is because populations are dynamic. Dynamic means change. So we can use the term population dynamics to capture a myriad of factors that are at play. Population work runs the gamut from are they here or not to calculating a harvestable surplus, which we'll get to at the end of this lesson. Population monitoring and manipulation makes up the core of management. You are a wildlife biologist working for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. One of your primary responsibilities will be to determine the population levels of a variety of species and decide if we need to do anything to change those levels. That's a huge piece of what wildlife management is. So let's look at the characteristics of a population. We might just be simply looking at numbers, abundance. We might put that abundance with on a per acre basis, more of a density. We might look at how that population is spread across the landscape. What's the geographic range? What's the home range? What's the territory? We might want to look at age and sex ratio, so a male to female ratio. What's the adult to subadult to young numbers within a population? Or is there a typical number within a population? What is the death rate? And we know death rate is mortality. And what is the birth rate or natality of the population? What's the production or growth? And when we talk about production or growth, we're usually talking more about a biomass accumulation in a set time. Most areas can support a certain amount of biomass, so a few large individuals or many small individuals. And we really don't use biomass too much when we're talking about terrestrial species, but we do use it a lot when we're talking about aquatic species like fish. So our populations have a certain structure, and that structure, all of these characteristics combined can give us a good idea of what the overall dynamics of that population really is. So it can be just your size and your number. It can be your age structure, your male-female ratio. So you may see something like this. The Poudre River elk herd has approximately 4,850 animals. There's your size. Spread over 120 square miles. There's your area, with 8 localized herds. With 33 bulls to 100 cows, there's your sex ratio, 70% adult and 30% young of the year, with a birth rate of 97% of calves per cow. So a little bit under one successful calf produced for every cow, and a mortality rate of 20% per year. So that description right there, that would be a good description for one population. Rather than just simply giving a number of individuals, this gives a whole lot more insight into what's going on in that population. Now, some basic ecological principles here at play, and I've touched on these briefly in class, but our biotic potential is the maximum reproductive potential under ideal conditions. So it's like this. You've got a population of 2 animals, and they can each produce 2 offspring. So the next year, you're going to have those original 2 plus the 4 new ones. So you're going to have 6. And you're going to just keep exponentially going up because then those 6 each have 2. So you're going to end up with 36. And you're going to keep going up and up and up in this curve that we're going to later call a J curve. It's an exponential growth rate because essentially our population will double or more than double every single year. It'll exponentially double. So there's an assumption here, and we'll talk about this next, but the assumption is that this is ideal conditions. Nothing is getting in the way, everything is going right, and we are maximizing the number of young that we can produce per female, per reproducing adult. However, that's rarely the case in reality. And actually, let's talk about when this might be the case. This is often the case when we have an invasive species. When we don't have anything in our environment to limit that maximum potential, then we might get a population growth rate that looks a little bit like this curve. And that can be a little scary because they can quickly overtake an area. But more often than not, we have some type of environmental resistance that pushes down on the population, and those can be either biotic or abiotic, and they interact to limit the abundance of a population. So essentially, they're going to come in here and push down on this population to keep this line, let's see if I can draw on this, that wants to go up and up, it's going to start saying, no, 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 you can't continue to go up. And it's going to exert some kind of resistance then on that population. Let me see if I can get rid of this. All right, so this is my famous hole in the bucket example. If your bucket is your potential population, you can only put enough water in, or you can only put as much water in the bucket as the bucket is big. And if you shoot a hole in your bucket, then you may get an example of like a limiting factor. Where'd my cursor go? So maybe your hole's right here and it's weather. You have a big storm come in, so you have some animals die off or your water leaves your bucket. You shoot a different hole in your bucket like predators and hunting, and it's all the way down here, so your population is going to reduce to this level now. Even though your bucket's bigger, you can't hold any more than you have holes in your bucket. So the idea here is that your environmental resistance can be a variety of different things, and one can replace another. And we call these environmental resistances limiting factors. So your limiting factor in this case would be predators and hunting. If we shot a different hole in the bucket way down here, there might be diseases and parasites. If we came in and we put a vaccine in those animals so that they were resistant to disease or parasites, then their population could increase until the next limiting factor. And limiting factors can be used quite often to control our wildlife populations, because we know if we can identify the limiting factor and fix it, we can increase our population. If we have too many in a population, we might introduce a limiting factor. So it's the most limiting factor of all of your environmental resistance that can be produced into the population. So here's another visual of this same thing we just showed you. So how these two things work together. Your red line here is that exponential growth. We call that that J curve. And then your blue line here is what we call an S curve. And this black line, or K, is our carrying capacity. I don't know why we give it the letter K, but K is the carrying capacity. And so the carrying capacity is the idea is, what is the population level in which we can't continue to grow like we were growing? We can grow like gangbusters up until this point, but right here we're going to start leveling off at that carrying capacity level. So the status of these parameters is dynamic. You know, in fact, this is a very simplistic model of what's going on. Let me grab my pen here. Most of the time what happens is your population will go up, something will happen, and it'll come back down, and then it can grow again. It'll exceed that line, it'll come back down. And most often populations will kind of wiggle back and forth around that carrying capacity rather than flatline at the carrying capacity. And that's because they're dynamic. When those populations where those two factors come into play, biotic potential and environmental resistance, that's what we establish as our population level. Okay, so there's a few assumptions, and I said the first one, this J curve, an assumption here is that the animals are in a suitable habitat with a stable environment. Everything is going well. If we don't have those things, we're not going to have our maximum biotic potential being achieved. The second assumption here is that as the population increases, there is a density dependent factor at play with births and deaths, or natality and mortality. And so as it approaches this carrying capacity, we see that this J curve, that exponential growth that would have occurred, maybe we're not getting that quite as much because the animals are getting more dense and therefore they're producing less offspring than they absolutely possibly could. And that is what changes our J curve into an S curve. So eventually those two balance out and reach our carrying capacity. Carrying capacity then, if you need to define it, is the maximum amount of a species a defined area can support. It's hard to actually determine a carrying capacity. Usually it would take a lot of time and modeling to determine what it can support, but it is a really important concept to be aware of, because if we go way past our carrying capacity, we could see a crash. And in a slide here, I'm going to show you what happened with that. Okay, so let's quickly look at the main functions that influence the population: natality or recruitment, growth, and mortality. Let's look at the increasing pieces, the natality and fecundity. I'm going to introduce a new word here, fecundity. Fecundity is the potential for young. So with a female, it's the number of eggs produced per female in a lifetime. You could have a really high fecundity, but not a high natality in reality, because natality can be density dependent. Fecundity is not necessarily density dependent. Natality then is the number of young individuals born per unit of time, and we can refer to that as the fitness per female per year, and that's also referred to as the birth rate. Now, recruitment is the number of individuals that are getting added to the breeding population. So this is not the same as natality, because you can have quite a few individuals being born and none of them surviving to be added to the breeding population. So a juvenile of a species may appear adult in size, but if it is not yet functioning in a reproductive role, it has not yet been recruited to the population. So that period of time is going to vary dependent upon the species, right? You have some animals that may be born and mature to reproductive capabilities within 1 year. And then you have other animals that may take 2 years, 3 years, or even 4 years. Some species like grizzly bears may take even 4 or 5 years before they become reproductively active. And then the other piece of that is sometimes the environment plays a role in when that animal becomes reproductively active, and so does the density of the animals in that population. So there can be a lot of things that play a role in when animals are actually considered recruited to the population. Typically, we do think about it as a 1 year thing. So if they make it to their second spring or their second summer, we tend to kind of lump them all in as being recruited. And the other way that we can increase our population, other than natality and recruitment, is through immigration, which is animals moving into the population. And I try to remember this as immigration with an I, moving in. Okay, can you have an instance where you have high natality and low recruitment? Well, interestingly, we had this situation occurring with the Poudre bighorn sheep herd. The lower herd in the Poudre Canyon about 15 years ago was producing young. They were reproducing, they were having young, they were alive at birth, but they were all dying within a few months. In fact, we had a few years where we had zero recruitment. We had high natality, but nobody was living past that first summer. Well, you can imagine what will happen to your population if you have a period of time where none of the young survive. You're going to get a very old herd, and it's more and more susceptible to disease. And that's what had happened here. These ewes had lung infection that was transferring to the lambs, and they weren't able to survive. They were really susceptible to pneumonia once they were born. And so wildlife managers had to come in and say, well, the future of this herd is zero. This herd is going to die out, probably a long, painful death. And so they actually removed these animals, they euthanized these animals, and they brought in a new group of sheep to start reproducing and establish a new population in the canyon.